All right, we're going to look at Chapter 9, which is international trade. And what we want to be able to do is to look at what happens when a country decides to engage in international markets. So what we have here is the case for steel. This is the market for steel. So we have the downward sloping demand curve. So that's the demand of the domestic market. We have the supply curve. That's the supply of the domestic market. So again, the price goes up and down until quantity supply equals quantity demand for an individual country. But now let's suppose that this is the U.S. and they want to engage in a world market. That is, the steel they produce in the U.S., they want to be able to sell to foreign countries. Or steel produced in foreign countries, they want to be able to sell that to domestic consumers in the U.S. So let's suppose that we wake up one day and we decide to engage in the international market. And then we notice that in the international market, this is the price of the world. That is the international price. Well, with that price, what happens? Well, let's look at producers first. So again, here's the supply curve right here. Let's see if I can kind of highlight this right here. So here's our supply curve, trying to draw that a little thicker for you. So these are suppliers in the U.S. that are producing steel. So they have two options. One is they can sell it at the domestic price, or they can sell it to a foreign country at the world price. So the rational choice is we'll sell it to another country. If they're willing to pay more, you're going to sell it to a different country. As a result, the quantity supplied of steel is going to increase. These producers could not make money when they sold it at the lower price, but now they can sell it to a higher price on world markets. We're going to see the quantity supplied increase dramatically. So as a result, is the U.S. producers of steel will only sell to U.S. consumers if and only if they're willing to pay the higher price. Therefore, this now is the quantity demanded by those within the U.S. The difference between the supply and demand, since supply is higher, this is the export of steel. So when the world price is above the domestic price, a country becomes steel exporters. Well, is this good for the country? Well, it's definitely good for producers because all of these producers are able to produce at a much higher price, and we see the quantity supplied increase. But we also know now that these consumers in the domestic market here are no more, so it's not good for domestic consumers, but it's good overall for domestic suppliers. And if we were to ask the question of, is this good for the economy as a whole? Well, that's where we look at total surplus. So if we look at total surplus, this triangle here, let's actually draw that triangle. This triangle here is consumer surplus. So consumer surplus decreases from what it was in a domestic market. So let's write this. So when you have the price of the world is greater than the domestic price, then we get the country becomes an exporter. Consumer surplus decreases. And let's see what happens to producer surplus. Well, in this case, producer surplus is the price all the way down to the supply curve. Notice how much bigger producer surplus gets. So as a result, producer surplus will increase. And now we get this new little triangle right here. And this triangle is what we call the gains from trade. That is additional surplus that is not possible in a competitive market that's only domestic. And so when we think about going back to Chapter 3 of how do you exceed your PPF, well, you trade. And trade allows a country to exceed its PPF. In this case, it's similar in that trading with other countries allows the domestic market to actually get gains from trade, to exceed the total surplus than it would before. So the total surplus increases, meaning that producer surplus goes up more than the consumer surplus goes down. So when we talk about the case for steel, well, the U.S. would very much like to be able to sell steel on the world market if the world price is above the domestic price.